Can I welcome everyone to this webinar on the subject of recent events in Belarus. As many of you will know, that since the election last year, which was really a corrupted event in which the Lukashenka again stepped into the presidential seat, but without the support of the people. There have been huge numbers of protests taking place in Minsk and many arrests, many abuses of human rights, the use of torture, a whole discrediting of the justice system because of the way in which matters have been conducted. And in the last week, we've seen an escalation of this with, first of all, attacks being made upon the legal profession and on lawyers who represented protesters, but also incredible attacks now on human rights defenders and the human rights organizations in Belarus. Journalists too have been at the receiving end, anyone who is expressing any form of opposition. And on previous occasions, we've addressed the whole issue of the abuse of international law in bringing down an airplane in order to arrest a journalist who was on board. So what is happening in Belarus is a source of deep concern across the world, which believes in the rule of law and human rights. Tonight, I'm welcoming an incredible array of speakers, and I thank all of you who have attended to take part in this webinar. And so let me begin by introducing to you our first speaker. We have the opportunity for those of you who would like to use it of interpretation. And I want to thank our committed interpreter, Anton Klevansky, for joining us. And if any of you want to hear the speakers in Russian or in a Russian speaker in English, use the interpretation, which should be available on your computer or on your iPad. You'll see it if you look to the three dots, if you're using an iPad or whatever the symbol is on your computer. It will give you access to the interpretation. Press it, and it will ask you which language you would like to hear the translation in. Now, please use the Q&A because if you have questions, we would be very happy to place them before the speakers. Let me tell you that I will take a few speakers and then have a Q&A, and then move on to other speakers and then have another Q&A, so that, that there are questions addressed to some of the speakers who may have to leave before the very end of this webinar. So let me start with Mary Lawler, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. And as I mentioned, it's a shocking business that, oh, I see that Elena Edwards is our other interpreter, and welcome to Elena too. I see that she's come up on my screen. Now, I wanted to introduce Mary Lawler. Her work is as a special rapporteur is in dealing with the situation for human rights defenders in many different parts of the world. But of course, tonight we're talking about what's happening in Belarus, where the attack on human rights defenders has become really a source of alarm. So over to you, Mary Lawler.
Thank you very much, everybody. And it is a great pleasure for me to be asked to be with you today as we consider what we can do about Belarus. Just 3 days ago, I spoke with a diverse group of human rights defenders from Belarus. The sense of anticipation in their words was palpable. They told me how they felt a major crackdown on human rights defenders could happen at any moment. Sadly, we've seen in the last 36 hours that their fears were true. From what I'm hearing from local contacts since yesterday morning, at least 15 human rights defenders across Belarus and across different organizations have been targeted through home searches, detentions, and interrogations. Some human rights defenders are still uncontactable. I've heard of raids in at least 16 NGO offices, and that the authorities are sometimes smashing down doors to enter. It's shocking and upsetting information to receive. I've been speaking regularly with human rights defenders in Belarus since the deterioration of the human rights situation there last year, to try and gain a better understanding of what's going on and what can be done from my side to help. I have tried to engage the government using the main tool at my disposal, writing official letters called joint communications with other UN experts to the government of Belarus. I outlined specific details of human rights defenders at risk in the country, as well as my concerns, and I questioned them on the apparent flouting of their obligations under human rights law. Thanks to the work of human rights defenders and the NGOs who I am in contact with, I've been able to raise the cases of 15 human rights defenders with the Belarusian authorities. But it can be difficult to get them to substantially engage. They have partially responded to my letters, but they have done little to stop the persecution. As you know, woman human rights defender Maria Rabkova has not been released. In fact, recently she was handed down new charges and her detention was extended until the 17th of September this year. By that time, she will have spent a full year in pre-trial detention. She faces up to 12 years in prison. Just because the government ignore its obligation to respond substantively to me does not mean that all is lost. One Belarusian woman said to me that she refers to the communications that we send with her contacts with diplomats in local embassies. And I encourage human rights defenders now more than ever to get in touch with embassies on the ground where possible for practical and technical support or protection. It is important for me to make sure that states understand who a human rights defender is. The UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders was adopted by consensus in 1998 after 13 years of negotiation. So when states like Belarus start to detain and harass human rights defenders for their legitimate work, it's important that we respond and put on whatever pressure we can. In a particularly shocking case, Sergei Drozdovsky and Oleg Grablevsky from the Office of the Rights of People with Disabilities were detained and interrogated for their cooperation with the UN. Sergei is a wheelchair user and he was ill-treated in custody. But this must be a collective effort. I've been working with human rights defenders for a long time now, and I know how important it is to keep persistent and keep persisting. Small actions by NGOs at local, national, and regional level, and those by international and intergovernmental bodies and sympathetic governments together have an incremental impact. I see myself as a bridge between states and human rights defenders, raising concerns and trying to persuade states to act more justly. But it is a long and arduous road. On Monday, I heard from another Belarusian defender who described the way his government views HRDs as extremely negative. He and his colleagues are suffering from burnout. They have no plans for the year ahead except to try and keep working and to find little ways to preserve energy as they go along. As I'm sure we'll hear more about from the other speakers, and we already have, lawyers are being targeted by the government as a tactic to neutralize the work of human rights defenders. From the information that I have received, at least 20 lawyers have been disbarred. I've been seeing the same thing happen in China and Myanmar. Lawyers representing human rights defenders are disbarred, leaving human rights violations unchallenged and keeping human rights defenders in prison. In other instances, lawyers, their clients, are forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. This effectively criminalizes the sharing of information on human rights violations, and was exactly what happened to women human rights defenders Maria Tasenka and Maria Rabkova, and human rights defender Oleg Grabelevsky. Sometimes not even their families know what condition they're in or what they're being charged with until they appear in court. One woman defender told me that one form of persecution leads to another, and she's right. They can be attacked and then arrested. And once they're criminalized, then their NGO gets shut down, and it's a vicious cycle. Many face the tough decision of whether to stay in the country and continue to try or to flee for their own safety. Things are tough now in Belarus, but we've seen and come through tough times before. When I started in the mid-70s, the world was full of military dictatorships and autocrats and dictators right across Latin America and Africa, and the Soviet Union presided over Eastern Europe. And I've witnessed how with each despotic regime, there is eventually a tipping point, and brick by brick, human rights defenders make progress. We now have the advantage of decades of experience in how to do this sort of work and how to win. What is important is that we don't stay silent. Forums like these ones are very important, particularly for the platform it gives to defenders working on the ground. And so delighted to see some here. So they can guide us in the actions that we take. I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone else, particularly the human rights defenders with us today. Thank you.
Mary, that was wonderful. And it is so important that we keep reminding everyone of that tipping point that you've just mentioned. The fact that with every effort, we are putting a brick in a wall of resistance, and pulling down and pulling out bricks from that horrible wall that is impenetrable at the moment. So I do believe, like you, that a point comes where all of our efforts will come to fruition. So let me move on to Galina. Galina Arapova is a Russian lawyer and expert in freedom of speech. She is a member of the high-level panel that was set up by the Media Freedom Project, which is overseen by UNESCO and which is run by the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. And she is a very distinguished lawyer in her field. And I'd like to draw you in, Galina, to give us some of your concerns at this particular time.
Thank you, Helena, and thanks for a kind presentation, and it's a pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, we are gathering in quite worrying times when we observe a crackdown in Belarus, and unfortunately a similar situation is developing in Russia in the meantime. Therefore, I can't stay with you longer than I would love to, but still, we are following situation in Belarus with a high level of concern, because unfortunately we see that authorities are taking quite aggressive steps towards civil rights defenders, towards civil society in general, towards journalists, human rights defenders, and now lawyers. Their licenses are being withdrawn for the very fact that they've been defending those who need their help. And this is something new which we observe as a practice to silence not just civil society voices, not voices of independent media, but also legal voices. Legal defense is being another target to silence, to put civil society in a situation when they have no means to defend themselves. And we see that searches conducted in houses and offices of human rights defenders and media representatives of journalists are quite a worrying signal. It's not just a worrying, it's endangers modern civil society, and in the heart of Europe, we see that it's happening not in a far corner of the globe. It's in the middle of the Europe, and we have to recognize that. It's Russian society is following situation, not just understanding that it's something which is happening in some other country. It's so close to us. It's so similar to what is might happen in Russia. And today's news, which just were brought to me like literally 20 minutes ago, showing that Russian authorities are taking very similar steps against investigative journalists, since journalists from independent media project have been designated as foreign agents themselves, and media outlet have been designated as undesirable organization. So now they are facing serious threat personally and criminal liability for their professional activity. And of course, we see that certain cases are already there in Belarus, and we understand that Russian authorities might take it as an example, very useful and cheap example to silence civil society and make it quite loyal. And it's unfortunately the reality, new reality that we are facing now. And as a lawyer, as a media lawyer who is defending freedom of expression, I can't just look at this, and I can't believe it's happening in nowadays Europe. And I just wanted to bring a few names which it's important to remember that it's not just searches and new interrogations have been brought to the table yesterday when houses of human rights defenders and journalists have been searched. It's not just situation with Roman Protasevich and Sofia Sapega, who've been arrested and their airplane have been forced to land in Belarus. Alexandrov and Andrei Alexandrov and his partner Irina Zlobina are arrested in January and still under custody. So this is something that we have to remember, because new cases are coming, but those who already experience this pressure, they need our attention, need our help. And I want you to have like a fruitful discussion on this, because it's not just raise all these issues, but we have to find the way how to help our colleagues in Belarus, how to preserve civil society in Belarus and in neighboring countries, including Russia, because we are actually following, unfortunately, the same direction. So thank you, high-level panel and all the colleagues for organizing this discussion. And I will leave you for now. We'll be happy to come back once I deal with all the comments to international and Russian media with regards to just crackdown news on Russian investigative journalists attacked.
Now, I'm going to invite anyone who would like to ask questions of Galina or Mary Lawler to come in at this time, because I know that Galina has to leave us. I'm so grateful to you, Galina, for making the time, because I know that you have a vital meeting to go to, which concerns matters developing in your own country. There's a question here which is being asked, which is really about the business of sanctions. And it would be interesting to hear, perhaps from you, Galina, because I know that the Media Freedom High-Level Panel has recommended the use of sanctions as a way of going after governments that abuse, for example, freedom of speech and the rights of journalists. This question is asking, and it's from the Shadow Europe Minister, Catherine West, MP, it's been put forward by Darren Mason, I think, on her behalf, which is that the UK government has already implemented some sanctions, notably on the UK subsidiary of the state oil firm. Are there other tangible and immediate actions from the UK Parliament that would be helpful? So what would you think that ought to be happening in nations like the UK that they ought to be doing?
Well, it's hard to say because effect of personal sanctions or business sanctions is not quite clear. And Russia actually introduced criminal liability for those Russian citizens who are calling for introducing sanctions. So that's another level of risks. But still, we see that risks, that sanctions which are applied against particular businesses, they probably are less effective just because Russia, for instance, if we talk about Russia, and probably similar would be applicable to Belarus, they just switch into similar production, domestic production, and they just take it as a proud possibility to develop their own businesses and etc. But personal sanctions are always targeted at those who make decisions, and decision makers are probably those who might be endangered by sanctions more. Whether that will change their behavior and attitude, I don't know, because we are living these sanctions for quite a number of years, and you see that we experience crackdown now, even if when sanctions are already imposed. So.
Sometimes targeted sanctions, though, can be particularly directed and effective. I mean, for example, I've recently called in Parliament for sanctions against Mikhail Gutierrez, who is a Russian oligarch who's based in London, has a huge residence in the Belgravia, the most glamorous part of London, and he is a hugely rich person who owns the potash industry of Belarus, which is the most the biggest potash manufacturers in the world, and which is a fertilizer of real purpose. And so and his son is deeply involved in business connections with the son of Lukashenko. It's thought that he is propping up Lukashenko financially in a considerable way financially. And so if one could I mean, this man's been sanctioned by the European Union, but has not been sanctioned by the British Parliament. And I would like to see him sanctioned. I would have thought that sanctioning someone like that would have great impact on the Lukashenko regime. What do you think?
Maybe Belarusian colleagues might assess how that might affect their situation in the country, because it seems that authorities like Russian and Belarusian, they are deciding how to proceed regardless pressure from international community, from intergovernmental organizations, from parliaments of other countries, because the only reason for them to take any decision to keep the power, and that face all prices.
I mean, one of the things about sanctions that go against a country, as has happened with Russia over the issue of Ukraine and so on, is that the ordinary people of a nation suffer rather than the people at the top, who are the people who have power and who are making decisions. And so the appeal of targeted sanctions has always been that you're going after the very people who are responsible for some of the most appalling atrocities. I'd like to see us going after some of the judges who make terrible decisions in Belarus. Anyway, thank you, Galina. That was very helpful. And I would now like us to move on to Ale Aheyu, and we might hear from Ale. Ale is a lawyer for the Belarusian Association of Journalists, and he has really been at the front line acting on their behalf. Ale, perhaps you could help us now.
Добрый вечер, коллеги. Я благодарен за внимание к тем проблемам, которые есть в Беларуси. И, к сожалению, действительно, в нашей стране в последнее время количество проблем бьет все рекорды, которые видны, например, из мониторинга Белорусской ассоциации журналистов. Наша организация занимается защитой прав журналистов в течение уже 27 лет. И более 20 лет мы ведем мониторинг нарушения прав журналистов. И цифры за первое полугодие текущего 2001 года впечатляют. Только в неволе находится на сегодняшний день 29 журналистов и представителей медиасектора. Это медиа-менеджеры, это сотрудники неправительственных организаций, которые точно так же, как Белорусская ассоциация журналистов, отстаивали стандарты свободы слова и стандарты права на доступ к информации. Только обысков с начала года в редакциях и в домах журналистов в Беларуси было 107 фактов зафиксировано. 87 раз журналисты задерживались во время выполнения своих профессиональных обязанностей, либо в связи с выполнением этих обязанностей. На сегодняшний день, наверное, тоже есть, поскольку наша сегодняшняя встреча посвящена правовым проблемам, наверное, есть смысл вспомнить несколько вопиющих кейсов, которые белорусская правовая система уже сгенерировала, и есть риск, есть вероятность, что подобные подходы будут мультиплицироваться. Безусловно, это уже вступивший в законную силу приговор в отношении Дарьи Чульцовой и Катерины Андреевой. Это съемочная группа «Белсат», которая освещала акцию протеста в режиме онлайн, и акция протеста была посвящена смерти одного из протестующих, которых, к слову, в Беларуси 4 случая, подтвержденных от действий представителей государственных органов, 4 смерти в ходе протестов правозащитной организации зафиксировали. Так вот, освещение акции после смерти одного из протестующих привело к тому, что обеих журналисток осудили на 2 года каждую. Белорусская правовая система квалифицировала их действия как организацию действий, нарушающих общественный порядок. Правовая логика была белорусского следствия, белорусского суда в том, что поскольку они освещали, люди могли смотреть и, соответственно, знали, где проходит акция, тем самым они совершили координацию действий, нарушающих общественный порядок. В настоящее время находится под стражей журналист Денис Ивашин, который подготовил и опубликовала газета «Новый час», опубликовала материал о том, как несколько сотрудников бывшего Беркута, это спецподразделение милиции Украины, после Майдана бежали из Украины и устроились на работу в спецподразделение Беларуси. В ходе расследования были установлены их личности, было рассказано фактически, как происходило их трудоустройство, какие должности они занимают в белорусской милиции. Денис Ивашин уже около полугода находится под стражей и ожидает суда. Его обвиняют в том, что он воспрепятствовал деятельности сотрудника милиции, разгласив сведения, которые тот бы хотел оставить в тайне. Это вот примеры только 3 из 29 человек, которые в настоящее время находятся в неволе. Если говорить про нашу организацию и действительно о той роли, которую правозащитники играют в системе от абсолютного отсутствия права, то, наверное, на примере нашей организации вчера был 2-й обыск с начала года мы уже пережили 2-й обыск. Причем с правовой точки зрения обыск абсолютно бессмысленный, потому что нам не вернули ни оборудование, ни изъятые документы, которые были изъяты еще в феврале в ходе 1-го обыска. Более того, Министерство юстиции начало проверку деятельности нашей организации, как целого ряда других зарегистрированных в Беларуси организаций. И Министерство юстиции, затребовало от нас в общей сложности около 2000 документов представить им на проверку. И, соответственно, вся документация Белорусской ассоциации журналистов на момент вчерашнего обыска находилась либо в Следственном комитете по результатам предыдущего обыска, либо находилась в Министерстве юстиции на проверку. Тем не менее, вчера, воспользовавшись тем, что никого из сотрудников не было в офисе, в нерабочее время, рано утром, у нас в офисе были выломаны двери, И несколько часов длился обыск, о результатах которого мы не знаем до сих пор. Мы не получали никаких документов, и даже приглашенная администрация здания, где мы арендуем офис, тоже говорит, что фактически их позвали только посмотреть, как они выламывают двери, а к самому обыску представитель администрации здания допущен не был. Это вот такие зарисовки к картине того, что на сегодняшний день в реальности происходит в Беларуси. И, наверное, с уважаемыми коллегами мне бы хотелось обсудить такую формулировку, которую применяют к сложившейся ситуации, как правовой дефолт. Многие мои коллеги отмечают, что на сегодняшний день государство фактически перестало исполнять свои обязательства по защите прав граждан. Вся государственная машина направлена на репрессии. В случае какого-либо правовой попытки защитить нарушенные права, и прокуратуры, и суды, и все возможные другие силовые ведомства становятся на сторону лица, нарушающего права человека, как правило, это представитель силовых ведомств. Эффективных правовых механизмов в Беларуси в настоящее время внутри страны попросту нет. Все те механизмы, которые должны это делать, они являются частью карательного аппарата. И их цель – это исполнение репрессий в отношении очень широких пластов населения. Если посмотреть специфику преследования, то, наверное, в Беларуси не осталось ни одного сектора гражданского общества, которое бы не подвергалось на сегодняшний момент преследованию. Я согласен с коллегами, которые выступали до меня, о том, что очень важно защищать права тех людей, чьи права нарушаются, и мы стараемся этим заниматься. Особенно сложно это делать, когда организация, имеющая такую повестку в своей работе, фактически вынуждена заботиться о собственной безопасности, о безопасности своих сотрудников. И мы видим на примере правозащитного центра «Весна», который вчера был подвергнут массированной атаке, когда практически все руководство организации в один день было просто арестовано, изолировано, и даже подробности и основания, по каким причинам они были арестованы, на сегодняшний день государственными органами не сообщаются. По крохам мы можем только предполагать, что это напрямую связано с их правозащитной деятельностью. И в такой ситуации, тем не менее, белорусские правозащитные организации стараются сохранить свой статус, в первую очередь заботясь о собственном выживании, стараются помогать тем людям, чьи права нарушаются, и оказывать хотя бы минимальную, насколько это возможно, помощь жертвам нарушения прав. Я буду очень признателен, если коллеги подскажут какой-либо механизм, рецепт, как в системе государства, которое полностью игнорирует все правовые нормы, все международные обязательства, и вот согласен с госпожой спецдокладчиком о защите правозащитников, со многими механизмами специальных процедур ООН, государство в принципе отказывается коммуницировать, и то же самое происходит с механизмами договорных органов. Вот с учетом вот такого отношения и игнорирования принятых на себя обязательств, какие, может быть, вы можете дать белорусским правозащитникам советы. Также хотелось бы, наверное, обратить ваше внимание на то, что на сегодняшний день, мне кажется, наиболее эффективным способом как-то заставить власти Беларуси менять свои подходы к обязательствам государства в плане прав человека являются механизмы, во-первых, универсальной юрисдикции, которые имеются в правовых системах многих стран Евросоюза, и на сегодняшний день из достоверно известного это Литва, Польша, Германия, в ближайшее время, надеемся, Чехия будет возбуждать, ну, то есть либо возбудила, либо рассматривает возможность возбуждения уголовных дел для привлечения лиц, непосредственно виновных в репрессиях по уголовному праву своих стран. И многие организации на сегодняшний день занимаются адвокатированием создания международного органа, который бы занялся расследованием ситуации в Беларуси, и это необходимо, чтобы полномочия этого органа были как минимум приравнены к судебным, чтобы была возможность и полномочия для рассмотрения белорусской ситуации и вынесения решения по тем лицам, которые причастны к пыткам, причастны к смертям людей, причастны к массовому нарушению прав человека, к произвольным задержаниям. Список достаточно большой. На самом деле весь перечень статей Международного пакта о гражданских и политических правах белорусские власти за последний год, наверное, не осталось ни одной статьи, которую белорусские власти многократно не нарушили. И вот в такой ситуации, мне кажется, важна и солидарность, и, возможно, какие-то взаимные действия белорусского правозащитного сообщества, международного правового сообщества. Я надеюсь, что вместе мы сможем изменить ситуацию в Беларуси в лучшую. Спасибо большое.
Ale, thank you so much for that contribution was so important. And the description of those attacks on journalists is so shocking. And you're doing really vital and important work. One of the things that I have been made aware of is that I'm just going to. One of the things that I've been made aware of is that the Bar Association is now taking away the credentials of lawyers who are acting for journalists who are protesting. They're taking away the credentials of many of the lawyers. I think something like, at last count, I heard 16, but probably it's many, many more. So I just wondered if do you feel at risk yourself of having your credentials as a lawyer removed, because the Bar Association has now been captured by the state. It's no longer an independent bar association.
Если говорить об адвокатской лицензии, то я этого статуса был лишен еще в 2011 году, и на сегодняшний день я не имею права осуществлять адвокатскую деятельность в Беларуси. В 2011 году я тоже, в 2010-2011 году я защищал одного из кандидатов в президенты, и в Беларуси, к сожалению, это стало злой традицией – арестовывать кандидатов в президенты, а их адвокатов лишать статуса. Практически все электоральные кампании Поэтому я подтверждаю, что в Беларуси не та ситуация с моими коллегами, которых сейчас лишают статуса, и, как правило, воспользуются механизмом либо лишения через государственный орган Министерства юстиции, либо через так называемые механизмы органов адвокатского самоуправления, которые своими действиями подтверждают, что они становятся частью государственной карательной машины, а никак не органом, направленным на защиту прав адвокатов.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Can I now take us on? I mean, unless I would like to actually ask you, Mary Lawler. We've heard this about the way in which lawyers, and I'm going to be shortly, we will be hearing from the rapporteur, Diego Garcia Sayan, who has done remarkable work on this front. But I want to just ask you, Mary, how do you feel about the business of using sanctions? Because this is a new tool in the armory of those of us who are trying to advocate for the rule of law and human rights. And so I just wondered if you had any view on them at the moment. It's still early days to see about effectiveness, but we've seen Magnitsky sanctions increasingly being used by the United States, by Canada, about it now the European Union has adopted the Magnitsky regime, and we in the United Kingdom too. So I just wondered what your view was as an experienced international lawyer.
I'm not a lawyer.
Oh, well.
I have mixed views on sanctions, precisely for the reasons that you already mentioned. You know, on the one hand, if they're targeted, they can perhaps be effective, but on the other hand, they hurt a lot of poor people in a more devastating way. I suppose I would be guided by the voices of because my mandate is only human rights defenders, so that's really all I feel qualified to talk about. So my voice, I would be guided by the voices of human rights defenders on the ground, what they themselves would think would be effective. The other thing is, I actually met the leader of the opposition today in Dublin. She's here. And very interesting just to hear the whole context of what is happening on the political side, which I have absolutely no brief for, but obviously gives context. So to be honest, I really don't think it's up to me to come down on either side. And it's not that I'm being trying to sit in the fence. It's just I genuinely think we should be guided by the voices of the people on the ground. Thanks.
Good. Now, can I then move to Mary Fitzgerald, who is the Director of Information Democracy at the Open Society Foundation. She's been a great champion of democracy, and I'd love to hear what she has to say about the dire situation in Belarus. Mary.
Thank you, Helena. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I currently work at Open Society Foundations, but until about 4 weeks ago, I was a journalist. I ran Open Democracy, the global independent news website. And I really want to talk about the situation of journalists today. I must apologize because I didn't hear all of the translation of what Ali was saying. So if any of this is a repetition, I'm very sorry. I plugged in late to the translation. But I think one of the things I wanted to lift up to this group was, and I was talking with a Belarusian journalist just this morning, who's now based in Poland, who pointed out to me that although the sort of daring, audacious, disgraceful, effective hijacking of a plane to kidnap two journalists who were on board got a lot of international attention, and that was a good thing that it got international attention. They said every day a new journalist is kidnapped and held ransom in Belarus. And actually it's more than one a day, because in 2020, 480 journalists were detained. Since August, there have been at least 62 cases of physical violence against journalists documented. And that's obviously a far smaller number than the reality. And even during this crackdown, the journalists who have been put in detention have been there for a very long time. Their situation has got worse. And one of them is a prominent blogger and journalist, Ihar Losik, who's been in jail for more than a year. And he wrote, "They've decided to finish me off with humiliation and to strip me of my human dignity. First, there are endless undressings, naked squatting, being escorted in handcuffs, as if I were a particularly dangerous criminal. Once or twice a week, my cell is searched. Everything is gutted. With these constant searches and undressing, I feel like a prisoner in Auschwitz." That's just one person and he's been in jail for a year, pre-trial detention, and he's going to have a closed-door trial. Those reports make me feel so hopeless, but what I really wanted to do in this discussion was talk about all the things we can do, right? We've talked a lot about sanctions, and I think Mary's right to reflect the fact that it's a very nuanced and complicated instrument to use. But there's so much more that we can do from London, from other places in the EU. Another thing that was pointed out to me that I hadn't realized before was that by closing the airspace after that kidnapping, they've actually blocked exit routes for people trying to flee the country, because the land border is very heavily restricted in Belarus right now. So it's actually making it harder for people to leave, which is something that needs to be considered. And there's also a really perverse set of incentives going on here, where the more people that the authorities round up and stick into prison, the more, of course, we demand the release of political prisoners. But it creates a perverse incentive, because it gives the authorities an incentive to round up more people and then say, look, we're going to release them all now. What are you going to do on sanctions? And that in our calls for the authorities to reverse course, we really need to be thinking about far more. I mean, to paint the picture of all the news websites that have been blocked, offices that have been ransacked, new laws that have been passed to charge journalists with a variety of vague, ill-defined crimes to do with terrorism and you name it, right? It's the full bucket list. I mean, we have to be, if we are going to be doing sanctions and we are going to be doing conditional negotiating and carrot and stick approach, we have to do far more than demand the release of political prisoners. We have to demand the restoration of civil society that can hold this regime to account. And that has to be a very tough negotiation, and we can't give ground on that. The other thing I wanted to talk about today as well, and other things that can be done that are relatively easy if there's political will. It's really hard to get visas to go to other European countries. So there are journalists and human rights defenders who have to flee the country because of the appalling situation we've all been describing. And I want to hold up Poland as a great example of a country that has ended all visa restrictions for people fleeing Belarus, given them the right to work in Poland so that they aren't economically destitute, provided office space, shelter, equipment. And this is not exactly a model government when it comes to human rights on other fronts, but they've really stepped up here, and this is something that both the government and the opposition agree is the right thing to do. Lithuania similarly has provided sanctuary and shelter for human rights defenders and journalists fleeing this awful situation. And it's more than just being humanitarian, because if journalists and human rights defenders can continue to work, continue to support themselves, then they can continue to act as watchdogs and convey news that's happening from abroad. So it's another way in which we treat these people well, we allow them in, we give them their dignity and the resources they need. They can continue to do their work, and that's going to be really, really vital throughout all of this. They need psychological support, health support. We're talking about people who are suffering trauma here, and who, but in very many cases, are separated from loved ones and deeply worried about members of their family and their colleagues. The other thing we need to do, and this is something that we need to do as Europeans, is we need to lean on our neighbours, the would-be EU member states, the would-be NATO members, Georgia, Ukraine, etc. Lots of Belarusian journalists have taken shelter in Georgia, but the supposedly Georgian democracy, not so great on impunity for those who attack journalists, and the terrible violence that was directed against journalists who were covering the LGBT Pride March in Tbilisi. Belarusian journalists got caught up in that, and there should be no impunity like that exists anywhere within our sphere of influence and with our allies. Someone in the chat mentioned Agat, which I understand provides the Belarusian military with supplies. For some reason, this company was taken off the EU sanctions list 6 days ago. Nobody knows why. We should be asking those questions at the highest level. The other thing I wanted to point to was, I'm joining you from London. This is a global financial centre. And we are famous for aiding and abetting criminal regimes all over the world raise money. Last year, staggeringly, the Belarusian government was able to raise 1.25 billion on the London Stock Exchange in a debt issuance, despite already having an appalling human rights record. And we haven't just did the Belarusian regime. We've done it for Uzbekistan, Egypt, Iran, you name it. This is where they come. And I'm going to name the companies that were involved in this debt issuance. It was Citi, it was Refacen, it was Societe Generale, it was Renaissance Capital. All these companies, apart from Renaissance, have ESG commitments, which is environmental, social, and governance policies. And yet somehow they thought that it was a good idea to help with this bond issue. And it was more than that. I mean, the red carpet was laid out for the Belarusian regime. The Lord Mayor of London met with the Prime Minister of Belarus. Alan Duncan was there. Various political grandees were part of the apparatus that led up to this raising the money. We need to be asking now, or we need to be asking several things. What are these companies actually doing when they say that they have ESG commitments? Where did this money go? What's it being spent on now? Because the Belarusian government said this money will not be spent on sanctionable activities. Now, I'd be asking some pretty serious questions about that at this point. I think I want to leave you all with the impression that I think we need to get our own houses in order, both so that we're not aiding and abetting these regimes all over the world. Belarus is a classic example. I think we need to show solidarity in ways which are easy for us to do in terms of lifting visa restrictions, providing shelter, economic support, solidarity. You know, this supposedly in global Britain, right? We're supposed to be this brave new world of globalness, for want of a better word. And I really do think that the hostile environment that we've created in this country and the way that so many European countries could be doing so much more basic things to stand up for and support Belarusian journalists, Belarusian human rights defenders. I'd really like to bring all that into this conversation. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Mary, that was the most enlightening talk. I just want you to say slowly the names of those companies, because I want those who are listening to be making a note. And I caught the business about Renaissance Capital, but I didn't catch the other names. And I want you to tell us, because I think it's really important that people know what those companies are up to and that they are able to start calling them out, and that they may have ways of actually drawing to the wider attention or to the boards of those companies what they're lending themselves to.
I'd be delighted to do that. So I'm also going to post a couple of links, because this is, I'm proud to say, open democracy reporting. So I'll post links to the relevant articles, which names these companies, but it's Citi, that's C-I-T-I. It's Société Générale, the big French firm. And I need to check the spelling of Rafferson, which I've actually never come across before. So I will post the links into the chat to those articles. I do know that following revelations about this, there have been calls at high level of politics for there to be investigation into how this happened. But I'll post those links, and also sign up to the Open Democracy newsletter, because there's another piece of news about this coming next week. Okay, great. And do keep in touch with me, because that's the sort of thing that I can raise in Parliament. Okay. Can I now? So thank you for that. That was really, really interesting. I'm going to move on, because we've got a list of really terrific speakers and wonderful guests who have joined us today. I know that Mary Lawler has to leave, and I know that Galina also has to leave. So thank you very much for giving us your time. It was really great seeing you, Mary, and seeing you, Galina, and good luck with your important work. So I'm going to take us on now from Mary to Yuri Zhibladze. I'm probably not pronouncing that properly, and I would like Yuri to explain it to me how it should be said properly. He's a member of the working group on Belarus, and he has been running the Curie Solidarity platform. So where is Yuri? Is he with us?
Yes, yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Very nice. Please tell me how to pronounce your wonderful name. Yuri Zhibladze.
Yuri is easy. The last name is Zhibladze. Zhibladze.
Great.
It's a Georgian name, although I live in Russia, but my background is a mixed heritage. Well, thank you very much. As I was preparing for remarks at this important conversation, this meeting, the crackdown yesterday, of course, took all the attention, energy, and lots of emotions, and 24-hour following the news about colleagues and friends who've been taken to custody, no news, no connection, no communication with many of them. It is huge. It is huge. This is really a coordinated wave, massive wave of searches, detentions, and arbitrary arrests of human rights defenders across the country. At least 7 cities possibly more now, where these searches and detention were happening, and altogether, at least, I think at the latest count, 20 offices of NGOs, media outlets, and political movements were searched, often broken in by force, and at least 30 people, I think, again by the latest count, were detained and interrogated, and among them, at least 11 were arrested and left kept in custody for at least 3 more days in the framework of a criminal investigation. Of these 11, 8 are members of Human Rights Center Vesna. So Vesna has been, of course, in the center of this attack, but other key groups such as Belarusian Association of Journalists, Legal Transformation Center, Law Trend, Human Constanta, Belarusian Helsinki Committee, Gender Perspectives, and others have been targeted. It seems that most, if not all of them, are investigated in a very broad and expansive criminal case under Article 342 of the Criminal Code, organization and preparation of actions violating public order or active participation in such actions. This case essentially was opened back in February, and we know that Vesna and the International Committee for Investigation of Torture have been part of this case, but since February, dozens, if not hundreds of people have been interrogated in the course of this ever-expanding criminal case. It looks like the authorities are adding more and more people and more NGOs and groups into this criminal case, essentially focusing on financing of protests and training and preparing participants of protests through different educational activities. Actually, the very first arrest of the human rights defender from Vesna, Marfa Rabkova, who already has been mentioned today several times by Mary and others, that took place back in September. Actually, she was charged with training of protesters, with preparing them to protest. We don't have time to go through all the names of key organizations and people. It's still being in the process. Information is still being in the process of being compiled because things are developing as we speak. This has not ended yesterday. Today it has continued, in fact. It is massive, of course. Importantly, we need to put things in context. The searches and detentions and arrests were conducted only a day after the UN Human Rights Council adopted its resolution on the situation of human rights in Belarus, extending the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. That's one part of the context. Another one that was already mentioned by my colleague Galina is that this developments should be seen in close context with the recent statements by Belarusian acting government officials. Just a day before this crackdown, Lukashenka held talks with Putin, and during that meeting, he announced harsh measures against independent NGOs very directly. He made them responsible in his remarks for destabilizing the country and exerting individual terror. We know that autocrats love using the pretext of fighting terrorism. This resonates very well with Putin's ears, of course. He has used the excuse of fighting terrorism for repressions in Russia and also in the occupied Crimea. And Lukashenko directly said, we will find them and hold them responsible in a serious way. So this was a clear and direct threat. Just a couple of days before that, Vladimir Mackay, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, in his interview to the Russian leading propaganda outlet RT, called on the security forces of Belarus to deal with NGOs. So this was, again, a direct order, if you wish, invitation. And few days before that, the Belarusian KGB boasted that it was conducting a country-wide operation to cleanse radicals. This is a quote. And we now are witnessing what this cleansing looks like. This crackdown should be seen as a response by the regime to international pressure. This is very clear to me, including sanctions. This is typical for Lukashenko, to retaliate by targeting the same very people and groups whose work for human rights and democracy the international pressure aims to support and whom they aim to protect. It is important not to buy into his tactics by considering easing or lifting sanctions. I recall back in 2014 when Vyasna chair and our dear friend Ales Belyatsky was imprisoned last time. Now he's again in jail. So back then he was convicted for alleged tax evasion. So he passed a message to his colleagues and wider international community from prison. I know that we political prisoners, said Ales, are kept in jail as hostages. Lukashenko wants lifting of sanctions in exchange of release of political prisoners, said Ales. Don't do that. Be persistent, he said, and build up sanctions until the goals of ending repression, ending impunity, bringing perpetrators of violations to justice are reached. I strongly believe in effectiveness of sanctions, but I will get to this in the end of my remarks. The most recent crackdown that we are now witnessing, as of course, is part of this much wider, unprecedented state repression. It's a state terror, really, that started back in August in response to massive protests. And since then, the repressive machine has systematically targeted all initiatives, groups, and people involved in pro-democracy activities. We are focusing today on journalists, human rights defenders, and lawyers, but indeed, they are, of course, on the forefront, but dozens of thousands of people, as we know, have been affected by repression. And many of them may be described as human rights defenders, although they don't work in NGOs or human rights organizations. In the definition of the Universal or of the UN Declaration of Human Rights Defenders, they certainly qualify as human rights defenders because they were repressed, attacked, harassed because of their work to promote, defend, protect human rights. Well, in the words of the UN Special Rapporteur Anais Marin, rapporteur on the situation in Belarus, all segments of civil society in Belarus have been and continue to be targeted. It's not only the opposition, political opposition, and human rights NGOs and lawyers and journalists. Really, it is many charitable NGOs, think tanks and researchers. Of course, media. Well, we've been talking about the media today, but not only the media, mass media in a classic sense, but also online activists. Dozens of administrators of public groups in social media and Telegram channels that have emerged in Belarus as a key instrument of democratic change. They have been declared extremists. Their channels and groups blocked and administrators persecuted as extremists. It really seems that no one is spared by repression, be it pro-democracy student groups, figures of culture, academics, teachers, local community organizers, workers who went on strike and members of independent unions, medical workers, sport athletes, women, elderly people, minors, members of Polish Cultural Association, Catholic and Orthodox priests, and many others who expressed criticism about electoral fraud or state repression. Former law enforcement officers who reside in protest against the crackdown in August are particularly hunted for by the KGB and treated as traitors. It's really a steamroller of repression that suppresses all of the Belarusian society, leaving it no air to breathe. And we see several waves. The one that we are witnessing yesterday and today is just the latest one, but there has been several waves of repressions targeting specifically human rights defenders and NGOs. It all started back in September with, again, Marfa Rabkova being the first person to be arrested, and then her charges against her were toughened, in addition to training of people for participation in mass riots or funding of this activity. They added later in February participation in a criminal organization, and disseminating hatred against social groups. And she faces up to 12 years of prison term. Then in January, a leading and experienced human rights defender from Vesna, Leonid Sudalenko, and his assistant Maria Tarasenko were detained and faced the same charges as other people in Vesna, preparation of and funding of actions grossly violating public order. And then, we already had Oleg Grablevsky from the Office of People with Disability mentioned. He is in jail since February on trumped-up charges of fraud. And of course, Andrei Alexandrov, a good colleague and friend of many of us, who is not only a journalist, but also a human rights defender. He worked in many human rights organizations, including the one that I represent today, the Civic Solidarity Platform. And in addition to being accused of funding of protests, he later was charged with state treason, very heavy charges, and faces up to 15 years of prison term. And then it continued. In February, there was the first massive wave in one day, literally on the 16th of February. Vesna and Belarusian Association of Journalists and many, many others, dozens of groups and activists were searched, interrogated, detained. It all really resembles, the events of today and yesterday resemble what happened in February, but this time it's larger, it's much broader. Then again, in April, a few more groups were targeted, including the International Committee for Investigation of Torture and human rights organizations, VANO, and so on and so forth. So we can really have a huge, huge list of people and organizations targeted, and it looks like the goal of the regime is to completely eliminate independent civil society and force all human rights defenders and those who work for human rights to either stop their activities by force, by intimidation, or have them flee the country, as many unfortunately have had already to do. We were also asked to speak a little bit about the violation of the right to fair trial. I will only, of course, we have Ludmila and other colleagues who are more bigger experts than I in this, but clearly there are not only these numerous instances of pressure on independent attorneys, on the lawyers who defend victims of repression in the court, and as already mentioned, around 20 people have been disbarred, or their licenses have been taken away from them, including just yesterday, 4 people yesterday have been disbarred, just as part of this larger crackdown. But there are some systematic aspects of violation of the right to fair trial, of due process, that can be clearly seen in all investigations and trials on political grounds. Well, first of all, it is a wide use of torture, of course. Of course, specifically targeting those who were arrested on political grounds, and it's not only torture, but specifically aimed at extracting confession in the absence of attorney and videotaped. This is the most horrendous example of repression in the course of investigation, when people are forced to confess on the record, and then these videotapes or recordings are broadcast by the government propaganda resources, by the media, to intimidate others, and they are also used as evidence in the process, in the trial, during the trials. Then lawyers are prevented from meeting their clients. They are pressed for expression of their opinion in public. And as already said by Mary, many lawyers in many trials, in many processes, were forced to sign a non-disclosure statement. Or Helen, you said, I think, things like that. So this is essentially deprives lawyers from effectively defending their clients. Many trials are declared closed without any legal reason for that. And of course, this deprives the public and the human rights monitors from attending and monitoring the trials, and the defense from appealing to the public and communicating with the interested public. And finally, of course, there is a huge propaganda campaign in the media accompanying all the major trials and investigations. So what to do? We think at the Civic Solidarity Platform, I'm coming to an end of my remarks. At the Civic Solidarity Platform, we have been working a lot on Belarus, developed quite a comprehensive set of civil society recommendations on international support for a human rights and democracy transition back in November last year. And we just think that much more decisive actions by the international community are needed now. It's been too little, too slow. Unprecedented crackdown that we are witnessing requires unprecedented response, much more coordinated and swift and stronger. The international community just continues discussing, what tools to use. It takes weeks and months, and meanwhile, Lukashenka is totally destroying both the independent media and the human rights community. Some people will simply have nobody to ask for help, with civil society destroyed and defense lawyers disbarred. There are so many ways and tools, of course, including the UN instruments with the clear violations of ICCPR and CAT, with an obvious targeting of human rights defenders in a way that can be qualified as reprisals against their legitimate work and interaction with intergovernmental organizations such as the UN. All possibilities at the UN, including stepping up the work of the recently created UN expert mechanism on Belarus, should be taken. That a group of NGOs, including our members, made a submission to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and we believe that state parties to the Rome Statute should support this submission or submit their own request to the prosecutor to open investigation. We can talk more in detail about that later. And of course, universal jurisdiction, there are only a few timid steps now. We knew it takes a long time, usually. Much more resources need to be put by the governments into this work so that cases under universal jurisdiction are reviewed much faster and the perpetrators are brought to justice. Of course, people fleeing repression should be supported much more actively in obtaining asylum. Belarusian diaspora should be recognized as valuable interlocutors and as an important partner. Getting back to sanctions, financial and economic basis of the regime should be undermined further by first strictly applying those sanctions that have been already imposed, closing all the loopholes, which are many and used actively by the regime and its proxies, and by progressively expanding sanctions packages. Clearly, there are so many tools and instruments, including not only sectoral sanctions, but addressing the secondary market of the government bonds, targeting particular companies that trade with Belarusian regime and its supporters, and of course malign influence by Russian authorities in Belarus should be countered as well. Specific sanctions targeting Russian officials and organizations, including propaganda outlets and others, and financial supporters, banks that lend money to Belarusian regime in Russia from Russia should be also targeted. And it's not only governments, but parliaments, media, civil society, and others in democratic states that should quickly consider various ways of expressing their support and solidarity with the persecuted in Belarus, including increasing support for civil society and independent media, accommodating and welcoming those Belarusians who have been forced to work in exile and flee, adopting political prisoners and their families, and in many other ways. I'll stop here as my time has come to an end. Thank you.
Yuri, thank you so much. That was a really comprehensive description of the challenges we face and how the seriousness of these recent events particularly now really are demanding that there has to be something much greater impact coming from the international community. I couldn't agree more. Now, I'm going to now move to Ludmila Kazak, who's a lawyer who's been at the front line. I had the privilege of appearing with her on a platform recently. Ludmila, can I call upon you to give your presentation to the group?
Здравствуйте. Спасибо, что пригласили меня на эту конференцию. И за неделю, которая прошла с нашей последней встречи, действительно изменилось слишком многое. И на фоне вчерашних событий с правозащитниками, конечно, менее замеченным осталось результаты заседания нашей квалификационной комиссии в Министерстве юстиции, которая приняла очередные решения о прекращении действия лицензии известных адвокатов, которые защищали политических заключенных, вот, в том числе фамилии которых звучали вот в докладе Юрия. Я хотела бы упомянуть о том, что вчера Министерство юстиции лишило права на осуществление профессиональной деятельности Антона Гашинского, который защищает, бюро которого защищает и Андрея Александрова, и Софию Сапегу, и ряд других известных довольно-таки политических заключенных. И, как всегда, поводом к тому, чтобы лишить его права на осуществление профессиональной деятельности, стали какие-то там формальные абсолютно основания, как и имела место такая же ситуация в отношении других адвокатов. И, наверное, все знают о том, что 8 июля 2021 года исключен из коллегии адвокатов Дмитрий Лаевский, который являлся защитником Виктора Бабарика, и о том, какие меры хотелось бы предпринять, чтобы помочь ему не лишиться лицензии, мы разговаривали вот на нашей прошлой встрече, но, к сожалению, этого не удалось избежать. Все эти события говорят о том, что репрессивный механизм, запущенный в отношении адвокатуры, адвокатского сообщества еще в сентябре 2020 года, начиная с Александра Пыльченко, продолжается и, надо сказать, даже набирает обороты, поскольку довольно громкие имена звучат адвокатов, которые лишаются лицензии, и проходит это все с завидной регулярностью. На сегодня уже с учетом вчерашних результатов заседания квалификационной комиссии, по моим подсчетам, не менее 23 адвокатов лишились права на осуществление адвокатской деятельности, и все эти адвокаты так или иначе были связаны с осуществлением защиты по фигурантов по политически мотивированным, по политически чувствительным уголовным административным делам. Мы уже сегодня выслушали доклад Олега Агеева, который в 2011 году также был адвокатом оппозиционного лидера Андрея Санникова, и который упомянул о том, что он в связи с осуществлением защиты лишился права на профессию еще в 2011 году. Но, к сожалению, те события, которые разворачиваются сейчас, с сентября 2020 года по настоящее время, показывают то, что масштаб, с которым мы столкнулись, конечно, беспрецедентен. Адвокаты, которые имеют активную профессиональную позицию по тем делам, по которым они ведут защиту, наказываются буквально за все, за публичное озвучивание фактов нарушений закона, за непринятие мер реагирования со стороны государства на эти нарушения. И с целью воспрепятствования законной профессиональной деятельности к адвокатам со стороны государственных органов применяются в Беларуси различные формы воздействия, конечным результатом которых является лишение права на профессию. Так мы столкнулись с такими формами, как уголовное преследование, это то, что касается Максима Знака и Ильи Салея. Беспрецедентным было похищение, например, меня, когда меня похитили, получили доступ к материалам, содержащим адвокатскую тайну, наказали в административном порядке без законных оснований, а затем и это явилось поводом к тому, чтобы лишить меня в феврале 2021 года права на осуществление адвокатской деятельности. Прекращаются действия адвокатских лицензий, прекращается без законных оснований, например, за совершение адвокатами действий, которые якобы дискредитируют адвокатуру. Такими действиями признавались как факты привлечения адвокатов к административной ответственности, это и в отношении меня, и Максима Конона, Константина Михеля, так и высказывания по правовым вопросам в средствах массовой информации. Как пример можно привести ситуацию с Александром Пыльченко и с Михаилом Кирилюком. Также очень популярна сейчас у Министерства юстиции такая форма воздействия на адвокатов, как проведение очередных и внеочередных аттестаций адвокатов. Если раньше очередные аттестации адвокатов в основном проводились территориальными коллегиями адвокатов, то вот уже где-то на протяжении последних 3-4 лет это такая прерогатива Министерства юстиции и используется Министерством юстиции как рычаг воздействия, поскольку выявляются какие-то незначительные совершенно там нарушения, например, в ходе ведения адвокатской деятельности, которые практически всегда неизбежны, и это потом становится поводом претензий и, соответственно, таких жестких мер, как лишение права на профессию. Значит, большой резонанс вызвали и последние действия наших территориальных коллегий адвокатов, которые, собственно говоря, превратились в последнее время в некоторый придаток, я бы сказала, да, исполнительной власти, то есть активно помогая Министерству юстиции осуществлять действия, которые направлены на то, чтобы адвокаты были лишены права заниматься адвокатской деятельностью. Во всех случаях, когда Министерство юстиции принималось решение о прекращении действия лицензии адвокатов, к сожалению, территориальные коллегии адвокатов, в том числе и республиканская коллегия адвокатов, обнаруживали абсолютно полную свою неспособность защитить своих коллег, не желая при этом рисковать своими какими-то выгодами. Хотя защита адвокатов при любых обстоятельствах является их непосредственной обязанностью, которая установлена в законе об адвокатуре. Тот факт, что адвокаты, которые работают по резонансным политически мотивированным делам, подвергаются давлению со стороны своих же органов самоуправления, в форме применения мер дисциплинарного взыскания, одной из которых является исключение из территориальной коллегии адвокатов, что в дальнейшем дает право Министерству юстиции прекратить действие лицензии на право осуществления адвокатской деятельности, конечно же, настораживает. И мне бы хотелось как пример привести ситуацию с Дмитрием Лаевским, который 8 апреля 2021 года был привлечен к дисциплинарной ответственности в виде выговора за то, что он дал в средствах массовой информации свой комментарий о сомнительных нововведениях в закон об адвокатуре, которые, по его мнению, направлены на то, чтобы адвокатуру по итогу лишить независимости. И после того, как был закончены прения по уголовному делу в отношении Виктора Бабарика, значит, 8 июля 2021 года его повторно привлекли к дисциплинарной ответственности свои же коллеги, которые приняли решение исключить его из коллегии адвокатов, а поводом стало то, что в прениях по данному уголовному делу он заявил как о невиновности своего подзащитного, так и о невиновности других фигурантов, других обвиняемых по данному уголовному делу, прося их оправдать. В данной ситуации территориальная коллегия адвокатов сочла, что в его действиях содержится нарушение правил адвокатской этики, поскольку его позиция расходилась с позицией других защитников по уголовному делу, которые своих подзащитных просили признать виновными. Ну, ситуация абсурдная, безусловно, конечно, уникальная. И самое примечательное во всей этой истории, как потом выяснилось, стало то, что поводом для возбуждения вот этого вот повторного дисциплинарного производства в отношении Дмитрия Лаевского стало обращение в Минскую городскую коллегию адвокатов руководителя другого адвокатского территориального образования, в котором просили привлечь Лаевского к дисциплинарной ответственности. Таким образом, руками своих коллег в такой уникальной ситуации, по надуманному поводу, конечно, Лаевский лишился права на осуществление адвокатской деятельности. Надо, конечно, вспомнить и такие яркие случаи деятельности наших территориальных образований, как ситуация, в которой оказался адвокат Андрей Мочалов. В частности, его исключили из коллегии адвокатов тоже за совершение дисциплинарного проступка, даже не уведомив о том, что это произошло. И адвокат, выполняя свою функцию по защите по уголовному делу, узнал о том, что он уже не является адвокатом непосредственно в зале судебного заседания. При этом абсолютно очевидно, не принимая мер к защите адвокатов руководством публично озвучивается, что в данной ситуации адвокатам нужно обижаться только на самих себя. Во всех случаях решения об исключениях адвокатов были основаны на защите интересов каждого адвоката и всего сообщества в целом. Таким образом, следует констатировать, конечно, что адвокатские органы самоуправления не только не становятся на защиту своих коллег, что обязаны делать во всех случаях, но и активно способствуют Министерству юстиции в лишении права на профессию по той или иной причине неугодных адвокатов. Параллельно, конечно, хотелось бы сказать пару слов о том, Юрий уже упомянул об этом, насколько сложной в целом является защита деятельность адвокатов по политически мотивированным как уголовным, так и административным делам. И, конечно, для всего адвокатского сообщества, для тех адвокатов, которые работают по таким делам, это колоссальный опыт, каким образом можно и нужно справиться вот с препятствиями, которые создаются на ровном месте со стороны правоохранительных органов и которые безумно просто препятствуют защите, нормальной, качественной защите и не позволяют адвокату где-то реализовать те права, которые гарантированы ему законом. Речь идет прежде всего и о таких ярких моментах противодействия оказанию юридической помощи клиентам по таким делам, как, например, несоблюдение адвокатской тайны. Адвокатам и их клиентам в условиях мест заключения под стражей создаются такие условия для общения, для выработки позиции, в которых адвокатская тайна не соблюдается, нарушается право на конфиденциальность общения адвокатов с клиентом. Тоже мы видели в СМИ видеосюжеты, которые говорят о том, что беседы адвокатов с их подзащитными в условиях следственных изоляторов записываются, потом еще и придаются огласке. То есть адвокату, конечно, нужно быть готовым вообще ко всему. То есть ты абсолютно не можешь рассчитывать на то, что какие-то базовые гарантии, какие-то вот базовые абсолютно права доступны сейчас. И это очень, конечно, осложняет защиту по таким делам. Конечно, многое уже говорилось о том, что модная сейчас подписка о неразглашении данных предварительных следствия, данных предварительного расследования, значит, в принципе, запрещает адвокату фактически сообщать практически любую информацию о том, в каком положении находится его клиент. Фактически мы можем, наверное, говорить только о том, жив твой клиент или нет. Абсолютно любые подробности по уголовному делу, связанные с ним или не связанные с следствием, разглашать запрещается. И в продолжение подписки о неразглашении данных предварительного расследования, потом уже в судебных заседаниях стала модной, опять же, практика проведения закрытых судов, в которых у адвокатов опять же отбирается подписка о неразглашении данных уже судебного заседания, и фактически с начала следствия и до конца судебного процесса, то есть на всем протяжении уголовного преследования, фактически общественность лишена возможности знать какую-то правдивую информацию о том, что же все-таки происходит с тем или иным человеком. Конечно, надо упомянуть о том, что создается сложность например, ознакомлении с уголовными делами. По таким делам адвокатам не разрешают делать фотографии дел, что, конечно, ставит, во-первых, в неравное положение их с государственным обвинением, а во-вторых, с учетом объемности уголовных дел, безусловно, затрудняет защиту клиентов. Таким образом, в нынешних реалиях осуществления адвокатской деятельности адвокаты, добросовестно исполняя или пытаясь исполнять свои профессиональные обязанности, постоянно находятся под угрозой лишения права на профессию. Множественные примеры чему мы, к сожалению, наблюдаем. Я полагаю, что все-таки сейчас все адвокаты, которые работают по политическим делам, находятся под угрозой, поскольку достаточно малейшего какого-то формального повода для того, чтобы лишить их права на профессию. Ну а Министерство юстиции заявляет о том, что одной из главных задач, которая сегодня стоит перед ним в области регулирования правоотношений в адвокатуре, является укрепление кадрового потенциала. И, соответственно, на место тех адвокатов, которых по политическим мотивам исключают из коллегии адвокатов, прекращают действие их лицензий. Я так полагаю, придут идеологически выверенные кадры, для которых новая редакция закона об адвокатуре предусматривает особый льготный режим. Это касается претендентов в адвокаты из судебной системы, из других правоохранительных органов, для которых предусмотрены преференции в виде упрощенного приема в адвокатуру. Ну, если в двух словах, то новая редакция закона об адвокатуре, которая вступит в законную силу в ноябре 2021 года, как раз-таки призвана законодательно закрепить жесткий государственный контроль в адвокатской сфере и максимально ограничить независимость адвокатуры. Вся деятельность адвокатуры по новой редакции этого закона фактически будет управляемой подконтрольной Министерству юстиции. В итоге это, конечно же, неминуемо приведет к тому, что независимость адвокатуры будет полностью утрачена. Поэтому, конечно, я полагаю, что все-таки положение в сфере адвокатуры и те случаи беспрецедентного давления, прессинга на адвокатов, конечно, не могут оставаться незамеченными со стороны международного сообщества. И адвокаты нуждаются в помощи и в каких-то действенных мерах. Какие действенные меры предпринять, сложно сказать, конечно, в данной ситуации. Но я думаю, что все меры хороши. Время покажет, какие из них будут более эффективные, какие менее эффективные. Ну, если вкратце, да, то это примерно вот такая картина сегодня существует в адвокатском сообществе. И очень хорошо, что много публичной информации о том, насколько плохи дела с независимой адвокатурой в Республике Беларусь.
Ludmila, thank you for joining us tonight and for being such an important voice in speaking for what is happening inside Belarus, and that even those who are arrested cannot access lawyers because they in turn are being punished, and that your description of it is appalling. Yuri is very clear, and he wants everyone to know this, and he's got it in the chat. He says, "My colleagues and I strongly believe in the effectiveness of sanctions." And this is what I get certainly from my contact and great friend, Natalia Kaliade, who's the Belarus Freedom Theatre. He points out that they can be effective if specific goals are identified and clear benchmarks are established, that sanctions are applied consistently and built up progressively in regular intervals of time and are not lifted in response to steps by the regime, as happened back in 2013 and 14. And sanctions are applied by all key states in coordination. And of course, that's important. And, you know, we're seeing the European Union putting in sanctions. And I'm very anxious that the United Kingdom follows suit and doesn't leave out some of the people that are on the EU's list, like Mr. Gutierrez. Anyway, sanctions are applied by all key states in coordination. That sanctions affect not only key businesses and supporters of the regime, because basically they provide what he calls regime wallets, but also key sectors of the economy, but I would say also key sectors of the justice system, prosecutors and judges and people who are enabling these crackdowns to take place. And so I just wanted to tell you that was the position of Yuri. I know that Olga, who is a member of New Europeans and who has suffered herself at the hands of the authorities in Belarus, she believes strongly that you know, people in Belarus are suffering enough under Lukashenko, so they are not. They want sanctions to be operated against these particular people. So I just wanted you to know that those are expressions that have been transmitted to me. I know we're running out of time, and it happens so quickly when we're also intent on hearing as much as possible. I'm now going to call upon the UN Special Rapporteur on Judges and Lawyers, who is Diego Garcia Sayan, who is such an important voice in really addressing human rights abuses. So can I call upon you, Diego, because you've been doing such important work on all of this.
Thank you, Elena. Really, I am honored the possibility to be with all of you today to deal with this really terrible situation that is being faced by Belarusian people. Really, the protection of lawyers and bar associations is not dealt for the protection of lawyers and bar associations, and so it affects the society as a whole. So what we have been hearing today is an attack not only to all the individuals and to all the bar associations, but to all the Belarusian society. The mandate of the Special Rapporteur since the beginning has contributed to highlight the essential role that an independent legal profession plays in ensuring access to justice, and especially in ensuring the protection of human rights. Lawyers, an instrumental role in the promotion and protection of human rights are recognized in the basic principles of the role of lawyers adopted at the UN in 1990, as all you perfectly know, which stipulates that adequate protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms requires that all persons have, quote, effective access to legal services provided by an independent legal professions. At the same time, human rights defenders are usually lawyers, providing professional services aimed at promoting the human rights and fundamental freedoms of their clients. In this role, they fall under the protective scope of the Declaration on the Right and Responsibility of Individuals that has been mentioned today. And the Declaration on the Human Rights Defenders, which contains a number of provisions that protect lawyers whenever they provide professional assistance to individuals or groups claiming their rights. The Declaration specifically recognizes the rights of lawyers and other legal professionals to offer and provide professionally qualified legal assistance or other relevant advice and assistance in defending human rights and fundamental freedoms. But at the same time, lawyers, which are human rights defenders, and have the right and need to use freedom of expression, because in several situations, the way through which society increases their awareness of what is going on in a specific case in which a big human rights situation is under consideration, that requires the public to be informed. So the right of freedom of expression is the third component of this right of access to a lawyer and to human rights defender. Of course, as you all may imagine, I am really concerned about the deterioration of security situation of lawyers in Belarus following the last presidential election and what is happening in the last weeks and in the last months. An increasing number of attacks against lawyers in Belarus are attacks against basic democratic rights. An increasing number of lawyers providing legal support in politically sensitive cases, in particular those defending opposition figures and human rights defenders, are facing various forms of intimidation and harassment. The increase in intimidation and harassment of lawyers in Belarus must be understood in the context of a widespread campaign of repression against political dissent in the country. I have brought the allegation received by my mandate to the attention of the Belarusian authorities in 3 communications addressed in recent months, which address serious attacks against the independence of lawyers and violations of their rights, including arbitrary arrests and disbarment of those who defend prominent political figures. Among the lawyers mentioned in this communication, the case precisely of Ludmila Kazak was considered and included. The basic principles on the role of lawyers, which all you know, requires states to adopt all appropriate measures to ensure that lawyers can perform all of their professional functions, quote, without intimidation, hindrance, harassment, or improper interference, unquote. Where the security of lawyers is threatened as a result of discharging their functions, they should be adequately safeguarded by the authorities, Principle 16 and Principle 17. Furthermore, the principles provide that lawyers should not be identified with their clients or their clients' causes as a result of discharging their functions. Cases brought to the attention of the Special Rapporteur show systematic attacks on lawyers, which are frequently the direct consequence of the identification of lawyers with their clients or their clients' interests, and open the door to undue interference with lawyers' professional functions and violations of their human rights. Of course, I am seriously concerned that the situation of lawyers in Belarus is being exacerbated by the fact that no independent bar associations exist. Bar associations play a vital role in protecting and promoting the independence and integrity of the legal profession and its members. The contributions of bar associations is crucial in organizing access to the legal profession, in developing standards of professional conduct, and in handling disciplinary procedures against lawyers. But their independence should be guaranteed, as have consistently reminded in my reports and communications. Without the protection provided by an independent bar associations, lawyers are extremely vulnerable to attack and restrictions on their independence, especially from state authorities. Even worse, in places where bar associations are controlled by the state, lawyers often become an easy target of attacks from the very organizations that should be protecting them. Silencing and controlling bar associations not only poses great risks to the legal community, but also has far-reaching consequences as it erodes the rule of law and the ability of ordinary people to defend their human rights. In the report I presented in 2018 to the General Assembly, all these principles were strongly mentioned, among which I emphasized that, I quote, national authorities should support the establishment and work of bar associations without interfering with their independence. Conclusion, or what to do. The recent increase in arbitrary arrest, intimidation, and harassment of lawyers in Belarus, in particular of those who defend prominent political figures, is extremely concerning. These actions amount to a serious breach of several international and regional standards related to the free and independent exercise of the legal profession. Further, and stronger actions from the international community is needed. By one side, in multilateral bodies like the UN or the European Union, states must adopt all appropriate and stronger measures to ensure that lawyers can perform in Belarus all of their professional functions without intimidation, hindrance, harassment, or improper interference. International and regional standards also require states to avoid any participation in the functioning of bar association, which should be professional, independent, and provide for the protection of and accountability of lawyers. Of course, a resolution has been adopted in the Human Rights Council in the UN, and several additional steps have been taken without still any positive consequence. Not all the countries, members of the Human Rights Council, voted in favor of that resolution, and its implementation it's very weak and not sufficiently consistent. More things are needed to be done in all these multilateral organizations and put increasingly in the agenda what is happening in Belarus. But at the same time, and I agree with what has been mentioned in this meeting, a call of action should include private corporations, private financial organizations. We should bear in mind that they cannot ignore international standards if they do want to make business in a world in which increasingly international standards are being called to play a more consistent and prevalent role. I can imagine, for instance, the example of the Norwegian pension fund, the biggest pension fund in the world, in which they have a kind of committee that revises all the institutions in which this fund allocates their fund to exclude any financial organization, any mining corporation that violates human rights, that violates democratic standards, or that destroys environment. That is a figure that should be increasingly included in the agenda of governments in which, like as it has been mentioned right now, all the funds allocated in London, all the governments that without blocking the independence of these financial organizations, that should be part of a kind of public attention in which all these corporations, all these institutions should be part of a blacklist that should be included in one of the several multilateral reports that to address the situation in Belarus in the following months. So, call to action of the society, call to action to multilateral organizations, but as well to private organizations, so that the sanctions that eventually can be used to improve the situation. I fully agree with what Yuri has said, can of course touch the components of power and not the society with, for instance, limits of the export of certain products that may affect the right to food of the population. So many things can be done. What the UN can do, what specific thematic mandates that, like the one I performed, the one that Mary Lawler has, of course they can play an additional and very relevant role, But if there is no big concert to play democratically in favor of these basic standards in Belarus, there will be no success in the short or in the midterm. I appreciate Helena and all of you for the possibility to have participated in this very, very useful meeting and to follow up much closer what is happening in Belarus and the major challenges that for human rights standards in the world right now are being placed in this country. Thank you very much.
Diego, I thank you so much for your participation tonight. It's been so important to have your voice and to hear what your recommendations are, and to remind us that that really it's the UN responds to nations taking positions, and not to NGOs or even to voices of significant figures like yourself. And what we really have to do is be calling upon our governments to take serious action. And I'm glad that there seems to be some interest from the UK opposition in taking this up and making demands for action by the government. But you've just given us a sort of, if you like, a sort of template of what we might be able to do. It seems to me that along with what Mary Fitzgerald described to us as being the scandal of the trading that took place last year and the purchasing of bonds by big companies participating in a sort of basically propping up Belarus with significant sums of money, which are presumably being used, in fact, to further the aims of Lukashenko in ways that we would be highly critical of. It's just appalling that companies are doing that without any kind of comeback. And so we should be really doing something about this. And when you talk about looking at pension funds, looking at those hugely influential financial organizations and instruments, we should really be trying to focus on them and to access ways of calling them to account. And our governments should be reminded of their duties and responsibilities in relation to that. The way in which we're seeing the most gross violation of democratic standards and of human rights currently in Belarus. And so, you know, to be making money off the back of it is just disgusting. So, I mean, we really have to do something more active collectively, which isn't to say that we shouldn't also be calling out for, I mean, what I would like our friends in Belarus to be helping us with are the names of people like judges who are making repeated decisions, which we know that the judges, of course, are afraid, but some of the senior people in positions of authority within the justice system should also be added to these lists, partly because of the appalling abuse of the rule of law. No judge should be doing things which are countering the very basic premises on which the rule of law is founded. So I do want us to try and make a sort of better lists of people who could be sanctioned, and as well as people who are the financiers and the who are behind Lukashenko. I'd like us also to be looking at those who are serving his interests in those key roles within ministries, within the judicial system. And Alan Flowers has been in the chat, basically cheering on what you have said, Diego, and what Mary Fitzgerald mentioned about having to go after the financial interests and embarrassing governments for their collusion in enabling those financial interests to prop up Lukashenko's regime. So, and Alan, thank you for your contributions in the chat. I hope that people will take an opportunity of reading them. Alan has just said that the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office gets these lists and have been getting their names since October, and details about relevant companies. but somehow they seem to get filtered. But thank you very much for your contributions, Alan, because they've been very helpful in this side. Now, we've also had, one of the questions that came through was a question from George, someone called George, who sort of seems to, who says, you know, that it's been reported that funding is coming from places like the United States, from the National Endowment for Democracy, which has, of course, associations with the CIA, but the other governments may be supporting civil society organizations inside Belarus. And doesn't that, he suggests, lend some credence to the claims of people like Lukashenko when they say this is foreign interference in our domestic matters, our sovereignty is being interfered with, and basically the opposition is in the pockets of foreign entities, foreign regimes. You hear that said by China. You hear the same thing said by every other authoritarian regime in the world. They want to blame it all on outsiders interfering rather than on their own behavior. Does anybody want to say anything about that? Any of my speakers? Did you understand what George was claiming?
Well, there is a report, a reply by Lawler in Russian. So if you click,
has replied.
if you click on replies or replied questions, and then below George's question about NED, there is Lawler's comment.
Perhaps you would like to read it out to us in English.
Okay, I can translate. Or indeed, there was. Yeah, essentially, Alex says that the NED is actually he has no information about any CIA connection, but that the NED is controlled at different levels by the U.S. Congress, the State Department, and international and independent financial audit. These are all available in public access, and support by this endowment, any initiatives shouldn't cause political repressions against hundreds and thousands of citizens of Belarus. There are there are norms of international law that the government of Belarus took upon implementing, abiding by, and these obligations are blatantly ignored. This should not be the case. Our goal is to stop this and help people whose rights have been destroyed. That's Alex's answer.
Yeah, I mean, where else are people going to get support from, if not from governments who see this as being an outrage? I'd love George to have some very enlightening and sensible suggestion to make that can answer his own question. How else are civil society organizations to survive? How else are they going to carry on with their work? How else are they going to, when no longer able to work for organizations that are closed down, like media organizations, like human rights clinics, etc. Anyway, I think this has been a really important meeting at a very, very crucial time. And to draw together the threads, it seems to me that what has come through powerfully is that we really have to be bringing pressure to bear on governments and on the European Union and on the places outside, but particularly government, and doing that by shaming them into what their responsibilities are in international law. And I really do feel that it's crucially important that we shame companies. I mean, amongst the list that I saw included, I think by Mary Fitzgerald, or it might have been Alan Flowers, there was mention of law firms, Clifford Chance, and other law firms. I mean, it's quite shocking that law firms should be doing this and supporting a regime that is doing this to their professional colleagues and to the rule of law, which they are supposed to stand by. So I think that we have to be calling out law firms that do that. And I hope that lawyers who are listening will take the opportunity to do that. Because I certainly will be. Anything else that anyone would like to say? Now, there were two persons who asked to be included, and they are Lina Kushk and Olga Zubrilova. Do either of you want to say anything very quickly, because I'm afraid we've only got a minute or so left. I read out Olga's suggestion that that sanctions should be used. Do either Lina or Olga want to say anything? I don't see anything said. Apparently, there's a very good article on the Oxford Human Rights Hub, which you might want to access, which makes notes, which gives us notes about crimes against humanity and what constitutes such crimes, and to help us to use that way of seeing events in Belarus. So there we are. Okay, well, I want to thank everybody who participated. Sharing knowledge, feeling a sense of solidarity is not without importance. It's vitally important. And amongst the people listening are Belarusians who need to know that, that there is this concern internationally. And I want to thank everybody for participating. We had the most wonderful panel. And I want to thank each and every one of you who participated and giving us your knowledge, your wisdom, and your suggestions for what can be done to try to stop what is happening in Belarus, which is such a shameful and shocking thing to happen, in the 21st century. It's just disgraceful. So thank you all for taking part, and we have to keep meeting. This set of seminars, which Doughty Street Chambers puts together, is really important. I do particularly, my colleague in Chambers, Tatiana, is acting for some lawyers, and she asked me to make mention of them, and I think that maybe mention was made of it by Galina, but there are shameful and terrible things happening to lawyers, to human rights activists, to journalists, and to basically citizens who care about their country. So we have to be standing firmly with you all. So thank you for coming tonight. Ali, you had your hand up. Were you well translated? Is there anything you want to say finally? Because I have to close this down because
Да,
we're
уважаемый
running
коллега,
out.
спасибо большое за возможность выступить. У меня есть, наверное, в существующей ситуации в Беларуси хорошие новости. Как минимум сейчас стало известно о том, что освободили как минимум 2 политзаключенных. Это Сергей Сыс и Василий Поляков. Это наши коллеги. Василий Поляков из Гомеля и Сыс, который работает в правозащитном центре «Весна». Они на свободе. Это тоже, наверное, показывает, что мы совместными усилиями где-то даем сигнал Вселенной, и она отвечает вот такими, ну, наверное, в сегодняшней белорусской ситуации подарками нам всем. Спасибо большое за встречу.
Well, thank you. That's really, really good news. It really is. We want to end with some good news. There's not a lot of it around, but thank you, Ali, for saying that. So please keep in touch with us and join us again, because we will be keeping in constant touch with our friends in Belarus to know what's happening. Thank you. Diego, wonderful to see you again. Thank you. Galina,
See you.
Yuri, Ali,
evening.
all of you, and the Marys, all of you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Bye-bye.